going to go into some greater detail to talk about the central nervous system. As we have seen, the nervous system is essential to our lives and function. So protecting our nervous system is going to be an essential part of maintaining homeostasis in the human body. And there are a couple of different strategies that we employ to protect our central nervous system. So what would be one of them? How do we protect our brain and our spinal cord? We do this with the bones of our skull and our vertebral column. We can also use connective tissues to protect our spinal cord, and we have 3 different layers of membranes to help protect our spinal cord. Together, these 3 layers form what is known as the meninges. The outermost layer of the meninges is going to be our dura mater. That's the outermost layer, followed by the arachnoid layer in the middle and the pia mater on the inside. A homeostatic imbalance of the meninges might be meningitis. It's an inflammation of the meninges. It can be caused by bacterial or viral infection. It's very serious and can spread as it attacks the central nervous system. It can spread quickly to the brain and cause encephalitis or enlargement of the brain. And so it is very dangerous, and most everyone is going to be vaccinated against meningitis at some point in their life. Another protection that we have for the central nervous system is cerebral spinal fluid. So in addition to the skull and the vertebral column and the connective tissue layer, we also have the benefit of a fluid-like protection. The cerebral spinal fluid fills the space between the meninges, fills the ventricles, the internal cavities of the brain, and the central canal, the cavity within the spinal cord. So it's sort of like a fluid-like barrier everywhere. What are some of the benefits of this fluid? What sort of protection does this offer? Mostly, this is going to function for shock absorption, but it also does provide support and nourishment and waste removal. So this constant wash of cerebral spinal fluid helps maintain and helps provide nutrients to various parts of the central nervous system. The blood-brain barrier is one method that we have to protect our barrier, or to protect our central nervous system. The way that it functions is that it's a structure formed by tight junctions between the cells in the walls of the capillaries supplying the central nervous system. Ultimately, it's going to protect the central nervous system by selecting the substances that can enter the cerebral spinal fluid from the blood. In other words, there's no blood that's like going into your brain. What happens is instead we have molecules that pass out of the blood vessels and go into the cerebral spinal fluid and then bathe, wash, and provide nutrients to the central nervous system. It can inhibit many potentially life-saving, infection-fighting, or tumor-suppressing drugs from reaching brain tissue if they're not lipid-soluble. So here's a very interesting conundrum for pharmaceutical companies or pharmacists. We have, in order to get cancer treating, or any sort of drugs, life-saving, infection-fighting, tumor-suppressing drugs into the brain, they must be able to pass through the blood-brain barrier. The problem is, in order to do so, they must be lipid-soluble. If they are lipid-soluble, this means they're nonpolar. If they're nonpolar, what do they not readily dissolve into? Blood. That's very good. We've talked about one of the benefits of water is that water is incredibly soluble. Water makes up most of our bloodstream. Most of our blood is water. Most of our cells is water. So it's very easy to get drugs from our bloodstream into our cells wherever they need to go because they are soluble in water. The tricky part, meaning they're polar, the tricky part with passing the blood-brain barrier is that we need molecules that are lipid soluble or going to be nonpolar in nature. So this offers a very interesting challenge to be overcome by pharmaceuticals. So what we have here is sort of a drawing of the different parts of the central nervous system and how it's protected by the meninges, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the bones of the skull and the vertebral column. So spend a little bit of time with figure 8.2 when going over the structure of the protections of the central nervous system. All right, so next we're going to break down the central nervous system components. We've talked about protecting it, but now we're going to talk about the central nervous system itself. The brain is the body's central command center. It's going to be responsible for coordinating and regulating the body's other systems. And the whole mass of the brain is about 3 pounds, and it has the consistency of soft cheese. The cerebrum is going to be the largest part of the brain, and it's going to be responsible for the higher level thinking, interpreting sensations, language, decision-making, creativity, and memory. This portion of the brain is going to be divided into 2 hemispheres right along the longitudinal plane. Each side is going to receive sensory information from and directing the movements of the opposite side of the brain. The left side of your brain receives information from the right side and directs movement from the right side. Same with the left side of the brain. Yes. And the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And each hemisphere is going to have a thin outer layer called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is going to be an outer layer of gray matter. Gray matter is going to include neuroglial cells, nerve cell bodies, and unmyelinated axons. This is what gives it sort of that grayish appearance. White matter, on the other hand, consists mostly of myelinated axons. This is going to allow for communication between various areas of the brain, also between the brain and the spinal cord. The corpus callosum is going to be a band of white matter that connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So it's going to run sort of right down the center and allow for communication across both hemispheres of the brain. Here is a picture of what the brain is going to look like in all the different regions. What we've just discussed is the cerebrum. That's going to be the vast majority of the brain matter that we have talked about. This is going to make up about 83% of the total weight of the brain. What we see in this diagram is grooves on the surface of the brain that sort of mark the boundaries that follow the 4 lobes on each hemisphere of the cerebrum. There's going to be the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The brain contains sensory, motor, and association areas. The sensory areas, the primary somatosensory areas, receive sensory information from the body. The motor areas are going to contain primary motor area controls for skeletal muscles, and premotor cortex coordinates learned motor skills. Association areas are going to be responsible for communicating with the sensory area, motor area, and other parts of the brain. This is going to be responsible for analyzing input and acting upon that sensory input. Here's another figure that shows sort of the different areas of the brain that are responsible for gaining information and then also acting upon that information that is taken in. Next up is the thalamus. The thalamus is located just below the cerebrum. Its job is to relay the sensory information from the spinal cord up to the higher brain centers. It's also going to play a role in motor activity, cortical arousal, and memory. It's going to serve ultimately as the relay station for all sensory information except for smell. The hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining homeostasis of the body by regulating blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, digestion, and body temperature. It does all of this by coordinating the nervous system and the endocrine systems through the pituitary gland. And we're going to see a little bit later on how the endocrine system works to control and regulate homeostasis in the body. Oddly enough, it also regulates emotions as part of the limbic system. So it does play a role in not just our involuntary movement and control, but also our emotions. The next region of the brain is going to be the cerebellum. So real quick, try to take a moment and try and touch the tips of your fingers together over your head. And so without looking, reach up with both hands and touch your fingers together over your head. And keep doing this. Keep trying until you get it right. So that way your forefinger lines up with your forefinger on your left hand, lines up with your right hand. Your ring finger lines up with your ring finger on your left hand and your right hand, so on and so forth. So each of the fingers line up. The part of your brain that allows you to do this is your cerebellum. It's going to be responsible for integrating the information from the motor cortex and the sensory pathways, like your joints, muscles, eyes, inner ears, to produce smooth and well-timed voluntary movement. The cerebellum has the ability to learn from previous experience, and it compares the actual position of a body part to where it ought to be. And then it makes a prediction and calculates future positions of a body part during a movement that help you be successful in your repeated actions. So the more often you do it, the more your brain learns, the easier it is to perform that function the second time. So it does that comparison, compares actual body position to where it ought to be, and then it calculates future positions of a body part during that movement, and then it helps sort of maintain. It controls equilibrium in posture. This allows you to stay upright with information from your inner ear. So that's the role of the cerebellum. Next up is the brainstem. The brainstem is going to be broken down into three parts: the medulla oblongata, midbrain, and the pons. The medulla oblongata contains the reflex centers to help regulate the rhythm of breathing, force and rate of the heartbeat, as well as the pressure. It also serves as a pathway for all sensory information going to higher brain centers and all motor messages that are leaving the brain. So this is our information superhighway. The midbrain is going to process information about sights and sounds, and it helps control very simple reflex responses to these stimuli. So like turning your head towards a loud sound, or closing your eyes to bright lights, that sort of thing. The pons is going to be the bridge. It connects the spinal cord and the cerebellum with the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus. And it has a region that assists the medulla oblongata in regulating respiration. The limbic system is going to be defined on the basis of function rather than anatomy. So the limbic system is more about function than specific location in the brain. It's going to include several brain structures that are responsible for emotions and memory. The storage and retrieval of information is going to take place in two stages. There's short-term memory, which holds a small amount of information for a few seconds or up to a few minutes. And then the long-term memory, which is going to store a limitless amount of information for hours, days, or years. The hippocampus and the amygdala are going to be involved in these processes. Moving on to the spinal cord. This is going to be the message transmission and reflex center. This means that it can control automatic responses to stimulus without necessarily involving the brain, like the withdrawal reflex or the reflex to pull back your hand when you touch something hot. That message can actually be transmitted to the spinal cord. The message to pull your finger away can also come from the spinal cord before the message even registers in your brain that was hot. So it's going to be, so as such, this structure is very important. It has to be protected by the vertebral column, which runs from the brainstem down to the bottom of the rib cage. So its structure is going to be a tube of neural tissue packed within a central canal, protected by a stack of vertebrae on the vertebral column. The white matter is going to be towards the surface, the gray matter is going to be in the center, and its primary function is going to be to conduct messages between the brain and the body. And as I said, it serves as a reflex center. So here is just a diagram of what that looks like. We have our spinal cord wrapped inside our vertebral column, running down the length of the spine.
Reflexes are fast, automatic nervous system responses triggered by specific stimuli. A reflex arc is the neural wiring of a single reflex. A reflex arc consists of a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, usually at least one interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector, in this case a muscle. In response to a painful stimulus, sensory messages are carried to the spinal cord by a sensory neuron. Interneurons, which can be either excitatory or inhibitory, integrate information from sensory neurons and stimulate the appropriate motor neurons, which in turn stimulate the appropriate muscles. Because muscles work in antagonistic pairs, one muscle must contract while the other relaxes. In this case, muscles in the back of the thigh contract while those in the front relax, causing the foot to lift away from the painful stimulus.